July 29, 1944, Normandy. The hedgerows still smoked with cordite and crushed leaves. The air was thick with that peculiar metallic tang of burnt oil, mixed with the sour stench of rain-soaked mud and blood. Sergeant William "Red" Haskins, commander of a Sherman M4A1, squinted through his periscope. His knuckles were white on the handles. In the distance, half shrouded by mist and drifting embers, a dark silhouette rolled out from behind a ruined barn. It was a Tiger. The ground trembled before the crew could even hear its engine. Its long 88mm gun looked like a spear made of thunder. Every Allied tanker in France had learned to fear that sound, the deep mechanical growl that meant death was coming. Range, 800, Red muttered. His gunner, Private Langley, adjusted the sights and loaded a fresh 76mm shell. This was supposed to be their answer to the Nightmare, the new, improved American gun that could finally match the German beasts. That's what command had said. That's what the engineers promised. Langley fired. The recoil slammed through the hull. The shell screamed across the field, sparks and dust flying where it struck. Then it bounced. A dull clang like someone tapping a church bell. The Tiger didn't even flinch. Inside the German tank, the commander smirked. His gunner lined up, fired once, and the Sherman's world exploded. Red's tank lurched sideways as molten metal punched through the armor, slicing into the crew compartment. Flames danced across the paint, turning olive green into liquid orange. Through the smoke and horror, Red realized the awful truth. The Germans were laughing. On that battlefield, mockery was louder than artillery. German tankers called the American Shermans Tommy Cookers because they burned so easily. British troops joked they were Ronsons. They lit up every time. American crews tried to laugh it off, but in the foxholes and in the mess tents, the bitterness was real. The 76mm upgrade, rushed into production and fitted to newer Shermans, was supposed to be salvation. Instead, it was humiliation in high velocity. At the start, everyone believed the hype. The older 75mm had been fine for North Africa, where Panzer IIIs and IVs roamed the sands. But Europe was different. Now, on the cold soil of France, the enemy's armor was thicker, smarter, and more terrifying. The 76mm, engineers said, would level the playing field. Yet, as those first duels proved, it barely scratched German pride, let alone their tanks. To the Germans, it was hilarious. To the Americans, it was deadly. The Shermans came in columns, roaring forward with courage but armed with false promises. The 76mm could fire faster, yes. It was reliable, yes. But when that round hit the Panther's sloped front plate, it simply deflected. German crews bragged that their tanks were immune to Allied fire. And when those Tigers rolled through villages, civilians whispered that no force on earth could stop them. Inside every Sherman, men felt the weight of that laughter. Every clang of a ricochet was another insult echoing across the fields. The irony ran deeper than most knew. Back in Detroit, Lima, and Grand Blanc, American engineers had worked under crushing pressure. They weren't designing in luxury, they were designing in fear. Production quotas, political pressure, and field reports collided like gears grinding without oil. When the new 76mm was approved, it wasn't because it was perfect, it was because it was ready enough. They thought the war couldn't wait. But the soldiers on the ground would pay the difference. In workshops across Europe, the crews began modifying their own tanks. They welded on extra track links to the front to act as makeshift armor. They scavenged spent German shells to study them. Some even smeared mud on their hulls in hopes it might trick a rangefinder or stop a shell from penetrating. Desperation breeds invention, but also resentment. You could hear it in their voices. They said this gun could take on a Tiger. Yeah? Tell that to the poor bastards in Company B. For every new tank shipped overseas, rumors grew faster than reinforcements. That the new 76mm wasn't what it seemed. That the brass had oversold it. That somewhere, someone sitting in an office was calling their deaths acceptable losses. The Germans, meanwhile, reveled in their dominance. Propaganda leaflets dropped on Allied positions showed cartoon Shermans bouncing shells off a laughing panther. Captured radio chatter mocked them. "Why bother shooting? You'll only make us angry." To an ordinary tank crewman, each shell fired was a gamble between courage and futility. The battlefield became theater, and the Sherman was its tragic clown. Imagine the sound inside one. The ceaseless roar of the Continental engine, the claustrophobic rattle of the treads, the choking fumes of cordite after every shot. 5 men trapped inside a steel coffin barely 2 inches thick, praying their next move wasn't their last. And yet they fought on, because what else could they do? When the Tiger fired, you didn't see the shell, you saw the effect. Armor peeling inward like petals of a steel flower. The 76mm's return fire was like a child throwing stones at a hurricane. But the Americans had something the Germans didn't. Numbers. If one tank fell, another took its place. If one crew burned, another climbed into a new machine. They called it quantity has a quality all its own. But for the men inside, numbers meant nothing. They wanted a chance, not a statistic. That chance would soon arrive, but no one yet knew it. In the late summer haze, as the war dragged toward autumn, whispers began to spread through the ranks. Rumors of a new kind of shell. Something different. Something faster. The first mentions came from ordnance officers. Cryptic notes about tungsten, velocity, and experimental penetrators. Most brushed it off. They'd heard too many promises already. But somewhere behind locked factory doors and sandbag test ranges, a team of scientists and officers were about to change everything. They weren't building a bigger gun. They were building a smarter bullet. For now, though, the laughter continued. In one French village, a German Tiger rolled past a wrecked Sherman, its armor gleaming under the sun. A young German crewman spat toward the burning tank and muttered, "Plaything of amateurs." He didn't know it, but that insult would come back to haunt him. Because soon, the amateurs would discover something that ignored armor, defied arrogance, and traveled faster than pride itself. Something that would make every Tiger crew look twice before advancing. Something called HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing. Autumn 1944. The leaves across Europe were turning the color of rust, like the armor littering the fields. Every Sherman lost in the hedgerows seemed to whisper the same accusation. We weren't ready. In the ordnance labs of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, the air smelled of oil, ozone, and frustration. Test guns thundered across the proving range, each echo ricocheting into the hearts of the engineers who had promised the impossible, to make the 76mm matter. Colonel Leslie Simon watched from behind a blast shield as another test round fired. The shell streaked downrange, struck a plate of German Panther armor, and again bounced off. Puff of dust, a mocking clang. Failure. Again. He turned to his staff and muttered, "We're throwing rocks at giants." The technicians scribbled on clipboards, their faces gray with fatigue. They'd been at it for months. Longer barrels, hotter propellant, tighter rifling. Every tweak gave them a few millimeters of penetration. Never enough. Outside, trucks carried and captured German tanks, their armor glowing in the sun like bronze statues of defiance. Engineers measured, drilled, tested. The Panther's frontal plate was sloped at 55 degrees, a simple, elegant trick that turned even fast shells into ricochets. The Americans had nothing that could punch through at long range. Simon's superior, Major General Gladion Barnes, visited the lab that week. His words were blunt. "If we can't pierce that armor, boys, we'll be burying tank crews for the rest of this war." The tension was suffocating. Some whispered that the only answer was a new gun entirely, the 90mm. Others argued there wasn't time. The war was raging now. The Sherman couldn't wait for perfection. Simon disagreed. He believed in a subtler weapon, one hidden in the physics of speed and density. That night, in his cramped office filled with the hum of generators and typewriters, Simon studied ballistics charts. His eyes traced the columns. Velocity, mass, energy, impact angle. He tapped a pencil against the page and whispered, "What if? It's not the gun that needs to change. It's the bullet." He called in his metallurgists. men with hands scarred from years of handling steel and fire. They spoke of a rare, almost mystical metal, tungsten carbide. Harder than anything they'd ever used. Dense. Resistant to deformation. If they could fire a small tungsten core inside a lighter shell, it could travel faster, hit harder, and concentrate energy into a smaller point. A bullet that didn't crush on impact, it sliced through. That idea became a new phrase in military science. HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing. The first prototype was almost comical. It looked like a regular 76mm shell, but inside, hidden under the brass casing, was a smaller, needle-like tungsten slug encased in an aluminum sabot. A disposable shell that would shed away once the round left the barrel. They loaded it into the test gun at dawn. The air was cold, their breath visible as they took positions behind reinforced glass. Fire! The gun roared. A flash, a shockwave, and then silence. The plate downrange didn't ring this time. It shrieked. The tungsten core had torn through 10 centimeters of German armor and buried itself in the sandbag wall beyond. Simon didn't smile. He just stared at the perfect, round hole through the steel. The future of American armor warfare had just been born in that moment. Not with a new tank, but with a smarter bullet. But victory in science doesn't come cheap. Tungsten was rare, imported from China and Portugal in tiny quantities. Every ounce had to be rationed. Each HVAP shell cost more than 2 ordinary rounds combined. Procurement officers balked. Quartermasters shook their heads. "How many can we actually make?" one asked. Simon replied, "Enough to make them think twice." In Europe, the soldiers had no idea what was coming. Back in France, Sergeant Red Haskins' crew had survived 3 engagements since Normandy. Their tank, scarred, patched, half-painted with soot, was a veteran itself. They'd stopped believing in miracles. One morning in November, a supply jeep rolled into their camp carrying a wooden crate stamped secret ordnance material. Inside were a dozen silver-tipped shells, unlike anything they'd seen. Lighter, sleeker, marked simply M93 HVAP. The ordnance officer grinned like a man holding contraband. "Gentlemen," he said, "these will ruin a Tiger's Day." The crew didn't know what HVAP meant. They just knew they'd been given something special. Days later, during the push into Belgium, their chance came. The weather was cold enough to freeze breath to lips. A Tiger had taken position at the edge of a village, covering the only road. Every Sherman that tried to move up was shredded by its 88. Haskins' crew waited behind a barn, engine idling low. Smoke and snow drifted together in the air. The Tiger fired again. Another Allied tank erupted in flames. "Load HVAP," Red ordered. Langley slid the silver round into the breech. It shimmered faintly in the dim light. Range, 700. Up. Fire. The recoil slammed. The round vanished into the mist. Half a second later, impact. Flash. A hiss. Then an eerie quiet. The Tiger didn't move. Then its engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Black smoke poured from its hatches. "Hit confirmed." The radio crackled. Inside their tank, no one spoke. They just stared at each other, the realization dawning. The impossible had happened. The 76mm, the weapon of ridicule, had just killed a Tiger frontally. Word spread like wildfire. Across divisions, tankers whispered about magic bullets. Crews begged for them. But there weren't enough to go around. Some units received just 1 or 2 rounds per tank. For emergencies only. Those who had them became local legends. Those who didn't envied them. Logistics officers scrambled. Tungsten shortages meant only certain frontline units could be supplied. The rest were told to make do. The irony burned. The weapon that could turn the tide existed, but not in enough numbers to win the war by itself. In the laboratories, Simon received the field reports with a grim satisfaction. Panthers destroyed at 1,000 yards. Tigers penetrated through frontal armor. Morale skyrocketed where HVAP arrived. But he also knew it wasn't over. They were still outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting an enemy that evolved quickly. The Germans responded with thicker armor plates and new tactics. The race between shell and steel was eternal, each side pushing physics to its limit. Still, for the first time, the Americans had hope born not of faith but of mathematics. As winter deepened, the men in the field grew to trust the new ammunition. They polished their remaining HVAP rounds like gold, storing them separately from ordinary shells. They called them silver saviors. When they fired them, they didn't just hear a bang, they heard revenge. One evening, as snow fell over Belgium, Red sat outside his tank, holding one of the HVAP rounds in his gloved hand. He turned it in the fading light, admiring the smooth metallic sheen. "Crazy," he murmured. "It's not the size that matters anymore. It's what's inside." Langley laughed. "Guess that makes us the underdogs with bite." Red looked up toward the horizon where the sound of distant engines rumbled. Not for long. The 76mm's redemption had begun, but it was still just a whisper in the wind. The true test, the one that would turn fear into awe, was still waiting in the snow and fire of the Ardennes. The question was no longer if it could kill, but whether it could turn the tide. December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Cold, silent, suffocating beneath endless snow. The world seemed frozen in gray stillness, but beneath the calm, the largest German counteroffensive of the war was unfolding. They called it the Battle of the Bulge. Columns of panthers and tigers rumbled through the trees, their tracks grinding over ice and bone. The Germans were laughing again. To them, the Americans were soft, scattered, unprepared. Once more, the Shermans would burn. But this time, something was different. Inside the tanks of the 3rd Armored Division, men carried rounds that shimmered faintly under lantern light. HVAP, tungsten cord miracles. They called them silver bullets. They had so few that each shell was counted like a prayer. One shot, one chance. Sergeant Red Haskins' crew had 3. Just 3. They'd been stationed near a Belgian village called Hatton, a crossroads between life and annihilation. Fog clung to the ground like a ghost. Radios crackled with half-panicked orders. Tiger column approaching from the east. All units hold position. Red's gunner, Langley, exhaled through chattering teeth. "We hold? With what?" Harsh language. Red smiled grimly. "No. With math." Through the periscope, they saw it. A Panther tank crawling from the treeline, snow sliding off its hull like melting armor. It paused, turret turning, the barrel hunting for movement. "Range 1,000 yards, Red whispered. Langley nodded. HVAP loaded. He felt the vibration of the gun beneath him, that metallic heartbeat of anticipation. Fire! The shell screamed through the frozen air, a silver streak against the white horizon. It hit the Panther dead center and didn't bounce. Punched through. A perfect hole appeared beneath the turret ring. A heartbeat later, flames erupted from the Panther's exhaust vents. The tank lurched, then stopped moving altogether. The radio burst with disbelief. Holy hell! The 76 just killed a Panther head-on. For the first time in months, the laughter wasn't German. Across the Ardennes, the tide began to shift. Crews who once avoided confrontation now stood their ground. The 76mm, armed with HVAP, became something else entirely. A scalpel where once there'd been a hammer. The rounds flew faster than sound, cutting through armor like light through mist. Reports poured in. Panthers disabled from 900 meters. Tigers crippled in duels they expected to win. The hunted were becoming hunters. German intelligence began to notice. Intercepted communications revealed panic. A new American shell, high speed, high penetration. Avoid frontal engagement if possible. Tank commanders who had once laughed now issued cautious orders. Panthers approached in groups, weaving, afraid to face the new threat directly. In one encounter near Bastogne, an American platoon of 4 Shermans ambushed a convoy of 5 Panthers. Before, that math meant suicide. But with HVAP, the result was chaos. The first shot pierced the lead Panther cleanly through the mantlet. The second struck another tank's lower glacis, ricocheted upward, and detonated inside. Within minutes, the road was blocked by smoking steel giants. Their confidence melted away. When the smoke cleared, only one Sherman was damaged. Its crew still alive, shaken, but victorious. That story spread like wildfire through the Allied ranks. Men began carving little tungsten symbols onto their turrets. Tiny silver diamonds, marks of pride and fear reborn as power. Numbers, too, told their own story. Before HVAP, only 1 in 5 Sherman shots had any chance of penetrating a Panther from the front. With HVAP, that number tripled. At close range, even the Tiger's thick frontal plate was no longer invincible. Crews reported kills at ranges once thought impossible. The 76 millimeters, firing at over 3,400 feet per second, struck targets before the sound of the gunfire reached nearby infantry. The battlefield's rhythm had changed, from despairing ricochets to sudden, decisive blows. And with every kill, the myth of German invincibility began to crack. In Germany, armor engineers studied fragments of destroyed Panthers and Tigers. They were puzzled. The holes were clean, too clean. Dr. Ernst Niepkamp, one of the designers of the Panther, scribbled notes during a debrief. American ammunition now exhibits characteristics of tungsten core. We underestimated their industrial capacity. Pride had turned to panic. Even veteran tank aces like Otto Carius confessed in memoirs that the Shermans had teeth now. He described encounters where Allied tanks, once hesitant, now struck fast and hard, their shots cutting through armor, as if sharpened by physics itself. The front lines no longer belonged to arrogance, they belonged to adaptation. In the snowy forests, Red's unit pressed on, HVAP rounds loaded, confidence blooming like fire in their chests. They weren't invincible, Shermans still burned when hit. But now they could bite back. One afternoon near the village of Manhay, Red's platoon stumbled into a trap, 3 Panthers blocking the road ahead. There was no cover. Retreat meant slaughter. "Hold your fire," Red ordered. He waited until the lead Panther turned its turret toward them, exposing its thinner side armor. Now, 3 HVAP rounds left 3 guns almost in unison, thunder in stereo. The first Panther erupted in sparks. The second stopped dead, its crew bailing out. The third tried to reverse, but a final round hit its drive sprocket and jammed it in place. In less than 30 seconds, 3 symbols of German supremacy had been reduced to monuments of disbelief. The crew sat in silence, hearts pounding, snow drifting in through the open hatch. Langley broke the silence. "I think the war just evened out." Red grinned. "No, it just got personal." From that winter onward, the 76 millimeters was no longer a joke. German armor commanders learned to respect it, even fear it. They began to report high-speed American ammunition of extraordinary performance. Some even ordered their men to engage Shermans only from ambush or extreme range. The balance had shifted. In the air, fighter pilots reported seeing more burning German tanks than ever before. Ground crews cheered. Tank factories accelerated HVAP production despite tungsten shortages. Every round was worth its weight in morale. By early 1945, Allied tankers began pushing across the Rhine with renewed fury. The once mocked 76 millimeters became the workhorse of victory. And yet, there was something poetic in it all. The gun that had been humiliated in its first duels, that had seen crews burned alive under its thin armor, had risen again, not through brute strength, but through ingenuity. It was no longer the weapon of ridicule. It was the weapon of redemption. Every HVAP shell fired was more than metal and propellant. It was defiance made physical. In one final duel near Cologne, Red's crew faced their greatest test. A Tiger II, the King Tiger, the heaviest tank in Europe, nearly 70 tons of rolling terror. The streets echoed with its slow, crushing advance. Red's Sherman hid behind a wrecked tram car. Snow and dust swirled through the air. "HVAP loaded?" "Last one," Langley whispered. Red nodded. "Make it count." The Tiger turned the corner. Its barrel aligned perfectly with theirs. Both fired at the same instant. The world flashed white. When the smoke cleared, Red's crew was still alive. The Tiger wasn't. His turret lay twisted, black smoke pouring out. Langley exhaled shakily. "One shot." Red grinned, voice trembling with exhaustion. "One hell of a shot." That battle became legend. Crews across Europe repeated it like gospel. The phrase, 76mm HVAP, no longer meant desperation. It meant dominance. The tide had turned, not with brute force, but with the intelligence to fight smarter. For every fallen Sherman, every burned-out hull, there was now vengeance, measured in tungsten and velocity. Spring, 1945. The thunder of tanks across Europe had finally begun to fade. Smoke still curled from shattered cities, but the laughter, that cruel, mocking laughter, was gone. In its place came silence. Columns of American Shermans rolled past the wreckage of what had once been Hitler's armored pride. Burned-out Tigers, shattered Panthers, steel carcasses rusting beneath blooming fields of poppies. The war had chewed up everything. Machines, men, and arrogance alike. Sergeant Red Haskins' crew stood beside their battered M4A1 near the Rhine. Its olive-drab paint was scorched, its hull pocked with bullet scars. On the gun barrel, someone had painted in white chalk, 76mm, still laughing now? No one laughed back. The victory was real, but it was costly. Of every 4 Shermans sent to Europe, 1 never came home. Thousands of crews were buried beneath the fields they liberated. But within that sacrifice lay something extraordinary, proof that innovation could turn ridicule into revolution. The HVAP shell had changed more than battles. It had changed belief itself. Before it, American tankers fought with fear and fatalism. After it, they fought with confidence. They learned that even the mightiest enemy could bleed if you struck fast, smart, and precise. But the war's end brought new questions and new ironies. In April, Allied officers inspected captured German armories and research labs. To their astonishment, they discovered that German scientists had been working on their own tungsten-cored rounds, nearly identical in concept to HVAP. But they'd run out of resources long before they could mass-produce them. The Reich's obsession with heavier armor had consumed its own advantage. In chasing invincibility, it became vulnerable to speed. When American scientists studied the Panther and Tiger wrecks, they realized the cruel symmetry. Each German tank destroyed by HVAP had, inside its hull, small traces of the very tungsten Germany had imported before the war, tungsten that now, through supply chains and captured or returned to destroy its own machines. It was poetic justice written in metallurgy. Colonel Leslie Simon, the man behind the HVAP project, received a commendation in 1946. But he didn't celebrate. In his acceptance speech, he said quietly, "The real victory isn't that our shells pierced their armor. It's that our minds pierced our limits." His words summed up the quiet truth of every war. Invention thrives where fear lives. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied occupation teams cataloged every surviving tank for study. American officers brought engineers from Detroit and Lima to tour the wrecks. Among them were the same men who had once been ridiculed for designing the underpowered 76mm. Now, standing before a field of ruined Tigers, they ran their hands across the blackened armor and whispered, almost to themselves, "We did it." They'd learned the hard way that wars aren't won by the biggest guns, but by the smartest adaptations. The HVAP round had proved that lesson in tungsten and blood. The irony deepened as the Cold War dawned. The Soviet Union, once America's uneasy ally, began to study every scrap of Western technology. They were especially fascinated by the HVAP design. Within a few years, both sides were experimenting with even faster projectiles, APCR, APDS, and eventually Sabo rounds, direct descendants of the humble American innovation. What began as desperation in 1944 became the foundation for every modern tank battle to come. From Korea to the Persian Gulf, the principle remained the same. A small, dense core moving at impossible speed could undo any armor on Earth. The laughter of the past had become the doctrine of the future. In museums today, from Bovington to Fort Benning, the story still echoes. You can stand beside a Sherman armed with its 76mm gun, and if you look close enough, you'll find one of those silver-tipped HVAP shells resting behind glass. It's small, unimposing, but its history hums like a live wire. A nearby placard usually tells the same story in different words. Once mocked for weakness, the 76mm gained respect through science and courage. Children stare at the shells. Veterans nod quietly, and historians call it one of the great equalizers of World War II. But to the men who fought inside those cramped steel coffins, it was something else entirely. It was hope cast in tungsten. For Red Haskins and his crew, the war ended outside Berlin. They watched as the German army surrendered, their tanks lined up like extinct beasts. The tiger that once symbolized terror now sat with its gun lowered, silent, almost ashamed. Langley climbed onto its hull, kicked the armor once, and laughed. Not mockingly, but almost kindly. "Not so scary now, are you?" he said. Red just looked at him and replied softly, "Don't laugh, Langley. It taught us to fight smarter." That was the quiet lesson of the entire war. Arrogance loses to adaptation. In post-war interviews, German tank officers admitted their shock at the change. One Panther commander recalled, "We thought their guns were useless. Then suddenly we were dying from shots we didn't understand. Felt like magic. Later we learned it was science." The Allies had evolved, not through sheer numbers this time, but through precision. The HVAP shell was the manifestation of that evolution. Proof that even under fire, men can innovate their way out of despair. And it left a moral scar on the German war machine. The realization that supremacy is temporary, but ingenuity is eternal. When the Cold War turned hot in Korea just a few years later, U.S. tank crews again found themselves outgunned, this time by Soviet T-34s. And once again, scientists turned to the old HVAP concept for salvation. The lineage continued, stretching through the M48, the M60, all the way to the M1 Abrams. Every modern armor-piercing, fin-stabilized round, the kind that can hit a target miles away at hypersonic speed, carries a trace of that original idea from Aberdeen, 1944. The legacy of the laughed at Sherman lives on in every whisper of tungsten through steel. Today, when historians speak of the Sherman, they no longer call it weak. They call it resilient. It was never meant to be a monster. It was meant to endure, adapt, and overcome. And that's exactly what it did. In a way, the HVAP shell was America's answer to mockery itself. Every clang of ricochet in 1944 became the spark that forged innovation in 1945. The story's irony completes itself here. The Germans laughed at the 76 millimeters. They called it a toy. They said it couldn't kill. And yet, by the end of the war, those same Germans were hiding from its muzzle flash, praying they weren't next. History has a way of humbling the proud and rewarding the persistent. The tiger, the panther, the king tiger, all symbols of invincibility, now sit in museums as relics. The Sherman, meanwhile, became the backbone of armies around the world for decades. The laughter didn't just stop. It was buried beneath the weight of what that humble gun achieved. Colonel Simon's words still hang in the air like prophecy. Innovation isn't born from confidence. It's born from necessity. And so, the moral of the story echoes through time. Arrogance builds armor. Adversity builds velocity. Every time the underdog is mocked, every time a weapon, a machine, or an idea is laughed at, somewhere someone is already building its comeback. The Germans once laughed at the 76 millimeter Sherman. The world learned to never laugh at innovation again. By the war's end, over 18,000 HVAP rounds had been produced. Not nearly enough to supply every tank, but just enough to rewrite armored warfare forever. If mockery gave birth to HVAP in 1944, which modern weapon dismissed today will surprise the world tomorrow?